Even the hardest criminals, men who've stared down death, led violent gangs, and survived years in maximum security, say one place broke them more than any other: Red Onion State Prison. Tucked away in Virginia's Appalachian Mountains, this supermax is designed not just to control violence, but to crush the human spirit. What makes Red Onion so terrifying that inmates call it a living death? Tonight, we take you inside America's prison built to break even the toughest. Red Onion State Prison didn't appear by accident. It was born out of a crisis. America in the 1990s faced record crime rates, overcrowded prisons, and a growing wave of gang-related violence. Virginia's correctional system, like many across the United States, was under immense pressure. Officials believed the solution wasn't just more cells, but harsher, more controlled environments. Out of this mindset, Red Onion State Prison was constructed in 1998 as one of the first supermax facilities in the state. Perched on an isolated ridge in Wise County, far from cities and courts, Red Onion was strategically placed in a rural Appalachian community struggling with the decline of coal mining jobs. For the state, building the prison was a way to bring employment to a poor region, while also creating a place to bury the most difficult prisoners out of sight and out of mind. From the start, Red Onion was never meant to be a normal prison. It was modeled after the infamous federal supermax at ADX Florence, Colorado, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. At Red Onion, nearly every aspect of daily life was built around one thing: isolation. Prisoners were locked alone in small cells for 23 hours a day, their contact with the outside world reduced to brief interactions with guards or the occasional family phone call monitored behind layers of security. The prison could hold around 800 inmates, but it wasn't just numbers that made Red Onion unique. It was the mission. Administrators openly described it as a control unit, a place to send the so-called worst of the worst. Men too violent, too gang-entrenched, or too disruptive for Virginia's other facilities. Transfers to Red Onion weren't just disciplinary, they were reputational. If your file was stamped for Red Onion, it meant the system considered you beyond ordinary punishment. For many inmates, the transfer was described as a psychological death sentence. But the reality was more complicated. Reports later revealed that many men sent to Red Onion weren't the most violent gang leaders, but often prisoners who were mentally ill, young, or unable to adjust to prison life. Human Rights Watch, in its 2012 report, documented testimony from men who said they had been locked away in near-total isolation not for assaulting staff, but for relatively minor rule violations. Once placed inside, getting out of Red Onion's supermax units was almost impossible. The design of the prison itself added to the sense of dread. Narrow corridors, steel doors with tiny slots for food trays, and concrete walls meant prisoners could go weeks without seeing natural light. Exercise time, if granted, meant being taken in shackles to a small outdoor cage. Former prisoners later described it as feeling like a dog kennel, a far cry from a real yard. One former warden, Stan Young, once admitted that Red Onion wasn't just about security, it was about control. Everything from meal delivery to the angle of cell windows was engineered to reduce inmates' ability to interact with each other or the outside world. It's little wonder that by the early 2000s, Red Onion had earned a reputation as one of the harshest prisons in America. Lawsuits, testimonies, and advocacy groups began to paint a chilling picture. Men losing their minds in solitude, slashing their own bodies to feel something, or refusing food for weeks. In this chapter, we've laid the groundwork. Red Onion wasn't just a prison. It was an experiment in control, an attempt to test whether fear, solitude, and relentless security could permanently break men deemed unmanageable. In the next chapter, we'll go inside the walls, into the daily routine that inmates say was designed to erase their sense of humanity. Imagine waking up every morning to the same view: 4 gray concrete walls, a steel toilet sink combo, and a heavy metal door with only a small slot for food trays. That's the reality at Red Onion. Inmates are confined alone in their cells for 23 hours a day, sometimes longer if the prison is on lockdown. There is no real human contact. Meals are slid through the slot. Conversations with guards are limited to commands: cuff up, step back, tray in. Cells measure about 8 by 10 feet, smaller than most parking spaces. There's a narrow bed bolted to the floor, a thin mattress, and, if permitted, a few personal items, maybe books, letters, or a radio. For many men, these four walls become their entire world for years, sometimes decades. The routine is rigid. At dawn, trays arrive, usually oatmeal, powdered eggs, or grits. Inmates eat in silence, alone. The next 10 or 11 hours are spent pacing, reading, or lying on the bunk. At Red Onion, boredom isn't an accident, it's policy. The idea is to strip life down to survival, to make time itself feel like punishment. When it's time for rec, short for recreation, it doesn't mean a yard with other prisoners. Instead, guards cuff the inmate through the slot, shackle their ankles, and escort them to a small outdoor pen, sometimes called a dog run. Surrounded by chain-link fencing and concrete walls, it's a cage with just enough room to walk in circles. Some inmates describe staring up at the sky as their only contact with the outside world. For many, it's less about exa, our size, and more about remembering what fresh air feels like. Human Rights Watch reported in 2012 that prisoners often went days without seeing another human face. Eye contact was rare. Touch was non-existent. Phone calls were restricted and monitored. Visits required thick glass and telephones, and correspondence was screened. One inmate told investigators that the silence was worse than violence. I feared losing my mind more than being stabbed. Isolation has consequences. Mental health experts like Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist who has studied solitary confinement nationwide, warn that conditions like those at Red Onion can cause hallucinations, paranoia, and uncontrollable anger. At Red Onion, such symptoms were widespread. Prisoners described cutting themselves with razor blades, banging their heads against the wall, or going on hunger strikes, sometimes as the only form of protest available to them. But the fear inside Red Onion wasn't just psychological. Violence was still part of daily life. Despite the extreme security, stabbings, assaults on staff, and inmate suicides have all occurred. Between 1999 and the early 2000s, records show multiple suicides and attempted suicides, each one fueling the prison's reputation. Even guards admitted that the atmosphere was tense. When every man around you is simmering in rage and isolation, the entire facility becomes a powder keg. And yet, what made Red Onion especially terrifying to inmates wasn't just the walls or the rules. It was the uncertainty. Once you were in solitary at Red Onion, there was no clear path out. Step-down programs, which supposedly allowed inmates to earn their way back to general population, were criticized as confusing and nearly impossible to complete. Many men felt trapped in a cycle. One minor infraction could reset the clock, keeping them locked in isolation indefinitely. One former inmate described it as being buried alive. Another told lawyers that men would sometimes purposely get into fights or act out just to break the monotony, even if it meant harsher punishment afterward. By the time Red Onion reached national attention in the 2010s, its reputation was sealed. Not just a place of punishment, but a place where men lost themselves. For gang leaders, transfer to Red Onion was whispered about as worse than death. For the mentally ill, it was a spiral into despair. For everyone else, it was a daily battle to hold on to sanity. If the architecture of Red Onion was designed to silence men, their stories still managed to escape through letters, court filings, and interviews with journalists and human rights investigators. These testimonies give us the most chilling insight into what life inside actually felt like, and why even the toughest inmates feared it. In the 2012 Human Rights Watch report, prisoners described how isolation at Red Onion wasn't just punishment, it was psychological torture. One man confessed, "I'd rather someone stab me in the yard than stay in here another year. At least if someone stabs me, I'll feel something." His words captured the essence of the fear inside those walls, not of violence, but of slowly unraveling. Another inmate recounted how he would press his ear against the crack in the door just to hear footsteps in the hallway. "It reminded me I wasn't the only person left alive," he said. That need for proof of life, simply to know others existed, was a stark reminder of the crushing silence that dominated daily existence. Guards had their own stories. Some correctional officers admitted that working at Red Onion took a toll on their mental health. One former officer told the Washington Post that the atmosphere inside was like walking into a pressure cooker. He described men pacing in their cells for hours, talking to themselves, shouting at unseen enemies. You could feel the anger bouncing off the walls, he said. You never knew when someone was going to snap. Suicides were another dark marker of life inside. Inmates sometimes took their own lives quietly, with sheets tied to vents or bed sheets twisted into ropes. Other times, the attempts were violent cries for help. Lawyers for the ACLU of Virginia documented cases where men slashed their arms or banged their heads repeatedly until guards intervened. Each incident reinforced the prison's reputation. Red Onion didn't just punish, it drove men to desperation. Perhaps most haunting were the letters that trickled out. One prisoner, writing to his mother, described nights when he could hear screams echoing through the unit, men breaking under the pressure. The worst part, he wrote, is that I know tomorrow it could be me. His letter was later cited in advocacy campaigns to reform solitary confinement across the U.S. There were also stories of resistance. In 2012, a group of prisoners launched a hunger strike to protest the endless cycles of isolation. For weeks, dozens of inmates refused meals, some collapsing from weakness. Their demand was simple: clearer rules to escape solitary and access to basic human interaction. The protest drew national media coverage, and for a brief moment, the silence of Red Onion was broken. But not all voices were sympathetic. Some guards and state officials defended the system, arguing that Red Onion housed men who had proven themselves too dangerous for regular prisons. These are people who stab, who kill, who organize violence, one official told reporters. Red Onion exists because there is no other option. To critics, however, this justification rang hollow. As mental health experts pointed out, the majority of men inside weren't super-criminal masterminds, but individuals already broken by trauma, poverty, and untreated illness. For inmates, the label didn't matter. What mattered was the experience of living day to day in what one prisoner described as a tomb for the living. Testimonies from men who eventually left Red Onion, either through parole, transfer, or completion of their sentence, often carried the same theme. Survival required stripping away parts of themselves. One man said he learned to stop thinking about time altogether. Another described creating an imaginary family to talk to, just to keep his mind anchored. Some found faith, others found madness. Even hardened gang members admitted Red Onion shook them. A former inmate affiliated with a national gang told interviewers that his transfer to Red Onion was the first time he ever felt fear in prison. I wasn't afraid of dying, he said. I was afraid of losing who I was. By the late 2000s, Red Onion was no longer just a prison hidden in Virginia's Appalachian Mountains. It had become a flashpoint in the national debate over solitary confinement. Advocacy groups, lawyers, and international watchdogs all turned their eyes to this rural supermax, arguing that what happened inside its walls raised bigger questions about America's commitment to human rights. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, was one of the first to raise alarms. Lawyers documented accounts of men held in solitary confinement for years with no meaningful way out. They argued that indefinite isolation was not only cruel, but also unconstitutional, violating the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. In 2011, the Human Rights Watch report put Red Onion in the international spotlight. The report described prisoners who had been kept in 23-hour lockdown for stretches lasting up to a decade. It recounted stories of hallucinations, self-mutilation, and men spiraling into madness. The findings echoed what experts like psychiatrist Dr. Stuart Grass, Ian had long warned: prolonged solitary confinement can cause permanent psychological damage. The report shook public opinion. Journalists visited Wise County and published pieces comparing Red Onion to medieval dungeons. Editorial boards asked if America was torturing its own citizens in the name of safety. Even the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture weighed in, declaring that solitary confinement beyond 15 days could amount to torture, a direct challenge to practices at places like Red Onion. But perhaps the most powerful voices came from inside. In 2012, inmates staged a hunger strike, refusing food to protest the endless cycle of isolation. For weeks, dozens of men at Red Onion, and later at its sister facility, Wallens Ridge State Prison, starved themselves in an act of defiance. They demanded clearer pathways out of solitary, more recreation time, and basic dignity. The strike drew coverage from the New York Times and the Washington Post, pushing Red Onion's name into living rooms across America. Virginia's Department of Corrections responded defensively at first, insisting that Red Onion housed the worst of the worst and that extreme measures were necessary for safety. Officials pointed to incidents of staff assaults, stabbings, and organized gang violence as justification, but under growing pressure, they introduced a step-down program in 2012. The program was meant to provide inmates a way to earn their way back to general population through good behavior and compliance. On paper, it looked like reform, a series of levels that rewarded cooperation with small privileges, like TV access or more phone calls. In practice, critics said it was deeply flawed. Prisoners complained the rules were vague, infractions were arbitrarily applied, and one misstep could reset months of progress. Some men described it as a moving finish line. Hope dangled just out of reach. Despite these criticisms, the step-down system gave Virginia officials a defense. When asked why men were languishing in solitary for years, administrators pointed to the program, arguing that inmates had choices. Advocacy groups countered that real reform required reducing reliance on isolation altogether, not creating a maze of rules to justify it. Meanwhile, lawsuits continued. Civil rights attorneys filed cases on behalf of prisoners who had attempted suicide or suffered mental breakdowns at Red Onion. In some cases, the state quietly settled. In others, judges ruled narrowly, reluctant to interfere with prison security. The result was a patchwork of partial victories but no sweeping change. The tension between safety and humanity remained unresolved. For prison officials, Red Onion symbolized control, a place where even the most defiant gang members could be contained. For critics, it symbolized cruelty, a place where men were buried alive in concrete cells. What's undeniable is that Red Onion's name became shorthand for fear. Within the prison population, transfer there was whispered about as a fate worse than death. Outside, it became a case study cited in law schools, human rights campaigns, and policy debates about whether solitary confinement has any place in a modern democracy. When people talk about Red Onion, the focus is usually on the men behind its walls. But the prison's reach extends far beyond the inmates. It affects families, entire communities, and even the correctional officers who work there. For families, Red Onion is both physically and emotionally distant. Nestled deep in Virginia's coal country, the prison is hours away from major cities. Visiting requires long drives over mountain roads, expensive travel, and strict rules. Many relatives simply can't afford to see their loved ones, leaving phone calls and letters as the only lifeline. Then those are tightly monitored. Mothers have written about the pain of hearing their son's voice through a static-filled line, knowing they may never touch him again. Children grow up seeing their fathers only through thick glass. For families, Red Onion doesn't just isolate inmates, it isolates them too. The community around Red Onion also bears a complex burden. When the coal industry collapsed, prisons like Red Onion and Wallens Ridge were pitched as economic lifelines for struggling towns. Jobs were promised, and for many locals, correctional officer work became the only stable employment. But the reality of working inside a supermax is grueling. Officers face long shifts in high-stress conditions, overseeing men who are constantly on edge. Burnout is high. Some guards report symptoms of PTSD, depression, or substance abuse, mirroring the very psychological damage inflicted on inmates. Violence inside affects them too. Attacks on staff, though less frequent than in lower security prisons, still happen. Every shift carries the possibility of being spat on, assaulted, or threatened. The stress seeps into their families at home. Red Onion doesn't just punish inmates. It reshapes the lives of those tasked with guarding them. The ripple effects reach society at large. When prisoners eventually leave Red Onion, through release, parole, or transfer, they often carry deep scars. Years of solitary can leave men socially withdrawn, anxious, or volatile. Re-entry becomes even harder. Employers, landlords, and communities see a supermax stamp on someone's record and recoil. Instead of rehabilitation, Red Onion often creates individuals who struggle to reconnect with society. Critics argue that this cycle makes communities less safe, not more. Even within the prison system, Red Onion casts a long shadow. Other inmates across Virginia talk about it as a threat, a place you don't want to end up. The fear alone shapes behavior in prisons statewide. But fear, as psychologists point out, is not the same as rehabilitation. While Red Onion has succeeded in establishing control, it has failed to answer a deeper question. What does it mean to return people to society after years of isolation? The truth is that Red Onion is more than a building. It is a symbol of America's struggle with punishment versus rehabilitation, fear versus humanity. It terrifies inmates not only because of what happens inside, but because of what it represents. A prison designed not to correct behavior, but to erase it. Red Onion State Prison remains one of the most infamous supermax facilities in America, a place where silence is punishment, isolation is policy, and fear is the strongest weapon. Even the toughest inmates describe it as a living death, proof that sometimes the harshest prisons don't rely on violence, but on emptiness. The question now is simple. If prisons are meant to keep society safe, can a place that breaks minds and destroys hope truly achieve that goal? Or does Red Onion show us the limits of control and the hidden cost of fear? If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold realities of America's prison system. And let us know in the comments, do facilities like Red Onion make us safer, or are they proof that something in our justice system is broken? This documentary is based entirely on factual research from Salter Court Filings, Human Rights Watch, the 2012, ACLU of Virginia reports, United Nations statements, and reputable news sources such as The Washington Post and The New York Times. All information has been presented for educational and documentary purposes in line with YouTube community guidelines.